So it's my great pleasure to introduce McMaster's University President, Patrick Dean.
Well, many thanks, Richard. It's a great pleasure to be here. Good morning to everybody. It's a great pleasure to be saying these few words at the opening of the Asia-Canada Transnational Collaborative Research Conference. This is an initiative that is one of the things that has grown out of what is locally known as the Forward with Integrity Initiative, and many, many great things I think that will have a long-term transformative effect on the university have come out of that initiative. And in each case, they have been driven, as it were, from the ground up. The intention of what we were doing with that was to stimulate creative thinking about academic questions, both about the conduct of business in the university, but also about substantive academic areas of inquiry and teaching. And then to see which of those were most promising, which would have the most impact, and which would lead the university forward to do its work in the years to come in the most effective way, and to maximize the impact of the work we do on society and the world at large. So this is one of the most wonderful fruits of that process, and I know, today is, in a sense, yet another stage in an ongoing discussion about how the university relates to the world, how we should imagine doing our academic work in a global context, and what the most appropriate approach that is, both ethically and organizationally, and so on. I'll say a little bit more about that, but I'll just begin, if I may, by welcoming a number of special guests who've joined us today by way of Toronto and Vancouver. Because this is intended to be a discussion about collaborative research on Asia and on Canada's relation to Asia, we have the greatest authorities in the country on this subject. So I'll just introduce them to you here at the table. Joseph Wong. Joseph is the director of the Asian Institute, Holbert Professor of Innovation, Canada Research Chair and Professor of Political Science at the University of Toronto. Philip Kelly is the director of the York Centre of Asian Research at York University. Paul Evans, professor and the former director of the Institute of Asian Research at the University of British Columbia. And lastly, Cassie Rao, vice president and director of the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada. It's important at the outset of the day, I think, to thank some of my colleagues who've contributed to this event and to advancing the discussion on the subject. The Dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences, Charlotte Yates, the Acting Dean of the Faculty of Humanities, Ken Cruikshank, the Dean of the DeGroote School of Business, Len Waverman, and finally, John Kelton, Dean of the Faculty of Health Sciences. These people have all come on side to support this initiative, and I know will continue to sustain it in the discussions as we move beyond today. Finally, I'd like to extend a particular thanks to Natina Tan, Dr. Natina Tan from the Department of Political Science and the Asian Research Working Group core members, but particular thanks to Natina for really extraordinary work setting this up. I should say a word about the interdisciplinary working group, the core members of that group. These are people from a wide variety of backgrounds and disciplines. They include nursing, business, cultural studies, history, art history, anthropology, political science, and religious studies. There's a truly wonderful array of disciplines. And when we talk, as we do at McMaster, about the importance of interdisciplinary perspectives, even in an institution which has historically been quite good at that, we very rarely talk about an interdisciplinary approach that is that broad. However, when one thinks about ways in which the university should be contributing to our knowledge of and our understanding of and the advancement of our relationship with Asia, obviously approaching from all those perspectives at the very least is critically important. I was talking just a couple of days ago to the Vice-Chancellor of Lancaster University in the UK, with whom we've begun to build an interesting partnership. And this fellow was very, very knowledgeable about China. He had worked in China for a long time. And we got to talking about the whole question of the university and its relations with Asia. We spoke about things such as the Confucius Institutes and so on. And as he was leaving the office, he said to me, I've been in Asia for most of my career. I feel I've learned a great deal about it. But I also feel the more I learn about it, the more likely I am to make a mistake in dealing with it. This was a way of indicating to me the complexity of Asia and the kind of creativity and resourcefulness and thoughtfulness that has to go in to the kind of relations to be built in Asia in the future. MAC has strong connections, as many of you know, throughout Asia, a strong alumni base. In fact, we have more than 2,200 McMaster alumni residing in Asia, 900 of whom reside in Hong Kong. And in fact, at this very moment, our Vice President of Advancement, Mary Williams, is in Hong Kong meeting with our alumni. Now, just sort of looking at today's proceedings, there are three ideas that I hope will remain foremost, or uppermost, I should say, in the minds of everyone participating. The first of these is interdisciplinary. Obviously, what we're looking for here is a properly and richly interdisciplinary approach to Asian studies and research. The second notion is the idea of dialogue. Some of you will remember in the Forward with Integrity letter a discussion on the ethics of internationalization. I will be releasing in about a week an update on our internationalization project. And in that document, as in the original letter, there is a great deal of emphasis on the dialogic nature of any proper and fruitful international interaction. And the last word to think about is, of course, the notion of collaboration, which is, if not synonymous with, implicit in the idea of dialogue as the mode of approaching these questions. By connecting scholars and students from a number of different research areas, as we're trying to do today and in the future, the chances are good that we can effectively study, assess, and debate emerging trends in Asia and explore areas of overlapping research. Our hope here is to initiate a series of ongoing exchanges surrounding Asia, to develop a world-renowned community of researchers and scholars centered right here at McMaster. So by joining us today, you find yourselves either by design or by accident at the forefront of those efforts. So in addition to the 5 outstanding research panels that have been organized today, which touch on everything from finance and economics to human rights and healthcare, we're also very excited that there will be 2 student-focused components of this conference. An undergraduate poster competition, which will take place in the Student Center Marketplace, as well as a grant writing information session for graduate students. Something that has loomed very large in discussions on campus over the last couple of years has been the importance of engaging students in the world-class research that gets done at this institution. This is one of the reasons we have recently, in one of those infinitesimally small adjustments to the way in which we talk about ourselves, tried to signal this. We now describe ourselves as a research-focused, student-centered institution, as opposed to, I can't remember how we said it before, but the point is, and there's no comma that separates research-focused from student-centered. And the point there is that as an institution of higher learning and inquiry, the assessment of the adducing and assessment of evidence, the making of evidence-based decisions and assessments must characterize everything that goes on in the university. And that means from the first-year classroom, where a form of that has to be what we introduce our undergrad students to. Not only, obviously, through graduate studies and research, but beyond that, to the administrative aspects of what we do on this campus, so that there is now a culture of evidence collection and assessment that must characterize the whole place. So obviously, bringing students at the undergraduate level up to the master's, doctoral, postdoctoral levels, these students are critical participants in where we go in thinking about the center of Asian study that can be established here at Mac. So that takes me, I think, to the point with which I'd like to close, and that is that what we're really looking at through this event today is talking about the feasibility of building a center, what it should look like, what the challenges will be, what the goals ought to be, and for me, a critical question is what place a center for Asian studies and research should have within the overall international orientation of the university. Because internationalization is not just about moving students across borders. It is about higher education occurring in a fully globally understood context. It therefore has to have ramifications for the curriculum, it has to have ramifications for the classroom, and all of these things. It has to be, I think, transformative of our operations as a university in all their aspects. So I hope that the day will yield, as you get into the sort of brainstorming part in the latter part of the day, it will be an opportunity to discuss and thrash out a number of ideas that would potentially help us in establishing this center. That is the beauty of having in front of you this morning those who have led or are leading Canada's foremost centers for Asian research, so that we can have the benefit of finding out about how this issue has been approached at other institutions, what works, what doesn't, what might be desirable here. In talking to some of our first session panelists earlier on, I recalled the characteristic McMaster approach which gave rise to our medical school in 1970. Having decided that we should have a medical school, the decision was made not to travel around and borrow from all other existing medical schools, practices and approaches that cobbled together would give us a medical school. The approach was instead to say, beginning with the outcome desired, what do we want? What kind of graduates do we want to see going on to be physicians? And then what do we build in order to help those people emerge from the university as outstanding physicians? And we all know how that story played out, that people like myself with an abysmal record in the sciences, but very interested in humanistic issues, found themselves in medical school and went on to be, I believe, very good doctors. So That is the spirit which prevails here at Mac, I know, and it's that same spirit I call on all of you to exercise today, to learn from our guests what might be the best way to approach this, but also to hear from those people what they would suggest about approaching this, because we have the privilege of doing this from the ground up and from a kind of a clean slate. It's a critical part of how we're going to define ourselves internationally, and I'm really grateful to you all and to our panelists for coming today and for contributing to what I know is going to be an extraordinarily rich dialogue. Thanks very much, everyone.
Well, thanks very much, Patrick. And you've done a wonderful job of introducing our panelists. I do want to emphasize that we have the three foremost administrators, UBC, Paul Evans, Phil Kelly from York, and Joe Wong from the University of Toronto. Joe has just stepped down, or about to step down, in the process of a long step down from his position, and has been hugely successful. I think Phil Kelly is at York, which has a very strong tradition of Asian studies. And Paul has actually been in most of the positions. He was the director of the Joint Center for Asia-Pacific Studies, Joint York and University of Toronto, a long time ago, and then moved out to UBC and headed up their Asian Research Institute. And Kazi, I think, is really interesting because he has experienced life as a senior administrator in the office of a university president, University of Toronto, in the private sector, in the office of a president of a bank, and he's now associated with the Asia-Pacific Foundation. And he's worked in the Ontario government in the office of the Premier. So this is somebody who has a remarkable perspective in terms of the business, government, academia intersections. So what I want them to do is to speak for about 10 minutes each. I should also point out that these are well-known academics. I did promise Paul that I would show his most recent book, which is launched by the University of Toronto Press. But each of them is an academic researcher in their own right. Joe has a Canada Research Chair at the University of Toronto. And Phil, I use his work in my classes on migration, labor issues in Southeast Asia, and is probably the world's foremost expert. So we've got a high quality panel here. I've asked them to speak for about 10 minutes. In her usual extremely thorough fashion, Natina has given them some questions that they might think about. So I'm going to ask them to speak, each of them for about 10 minutes. Then I would like to get questions from the floor, because I don't want you to sit there and just absorb. I want to hear, we all want to hear what you have to say. And then I'll go back for the last 2 or 3 minutes to give them a kind of 5 minutes perhaps to give them a chance to round up. So we're going to go in the order in the program. Joe Wong first, then Phil Kelly, then Paul Evans, and then Cassie Rao. So, Joe, the first is Professor Joe Wong from the University of Toronto.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. I am a professor at the University of Toronto. I'm a professor of political science, and I first of all wanted to thank the organizers for giving me this opportunity to speak here today. At the University of Toronto, I teach Pol 101. Political Science 101, which has 1,200 students in it. So anytime, we teach it in Con Hall, so anytime I have an opportunity to speak to an audience of less than 500 or so, it feels very intimate to me, almost like a PhD seminar at the University of Toronto, as long as we're under 500 people in the room. Let me begin by congratulating President Dean for this remarkable agenda he's laid out for McMaster University, and for the rest of Canada for that matter. The Forward with Integrity theme and agenda, I think, is one that's extremely enticing, timely, and positions McMaster really to be a real leader in many aspects aspects of the academy and a global education. I also wanted to congratulate Natina Tan for putting together this day's event. I had the privilege and honor of having Natina as a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Toronto, and I saw her before she came to U of T as a remarkable young scholar, and I've seen her continue to develop as such. And I just said to Richard, as President Dean was feting her, I said, "You know she's a keeper." And he said, "Of course we do." The president was instructed to make note of the wonderful achievements of Professor Tan. As Richard has already told you, I'm stepping down as director of the Asian Institute. It has been a long stepping down process. I've been hosting farewell lunches now, it seems, for about 6 months. The Asian Institute was formed in 2001 at the University of Toronto in what was then called the Munk Center for International Studies. The Munk Center has now become the Munk School of Global Affairs. And I've had the privilege and the honor of being the director of the Asian Institute since 2005. One of the things that I want to stress from the outset, and I think it would be appropriate also for the kinds of conversations we'll be having for the rest of today, is that in many ways Canada, and most certainly the University of Toronto, was a late mover when it came to Asian studies. All of the sorts of first mover advantages that you would expect to come with a large university such as U of T are benefits and advantages we didn't experience. We were very late as a university in turning our attention to Asia. Asia had risen by the time we had started to think about a rising Asia. And just to give you some sense as to how late we were, I just want to recount to you what I think is quite a humorous story, particularly in light of Director Janice Stein. She's the director of the Global School of Affairs, the Munk School. Her stepping down as director there. I recall about 5 years ago, we were part of a delegation to Fudan University in Shanghai. And before we went in, of course, Janice, we know, is an authority on global affairs and so on. But her real expertise is in the Middle East. So in other words, she really doesn't know anything about Asia. And when we went to Fudan University, I said, "You know, Janice, before we go into this meeting with the Dean of the School of International Relations at one of the premier universities, you must understand that we are not first movers. That in many ways, we can't go in there with the sort of proverbial guns a-blazing and think that as the University of Toronto we can make the kinds of demands that we might be used to or accustomed to making when we visit other schools." Of course, she didn't listen to me, and she went in guns a-blazing. And I remember the very first comment from the Dean of the School of International Relations at Fudan. He said, "Well, Dr. Stein, this is all and well, but let me tell you how we do things with Princeton, Stanford, Berkeley, Oxford, Michigan, and Harvard." It was very clear at that point we were not first movers, and we were working from a position of great disadvantage. I do want to stress, however, that despite our temporal disadvantage, we have and enjoy tremendous advantages as we think about Asian studies and conceptualize Asian studies being from Canada. One of the most important exercises we engaged in as the Asian Institute in around 2005-2006 was we began to try to articulate what characterized a Canadian point of view on Asian studies. And our preoccupation at the time, and I think quite rightly, was how do we compare vis-a-vis our peer institutions in the United States? And one of the most important things that I think we have to remember about Canadian studies, about Asian studies in Canada, is that we are not in any way encumbered by the legacies of a Cold War approach to Asian studies. If you think about, and I indeed benefited myself as a student in the United States, if you think about things like the foreign language and area scholarships, if you think about the way in which departments were created, if you think about how research is funded in Asian studies in the United States, these are all funded through a Cold War set of categories. An understanding of Asia through Sino-US relations, an a priori understanding of relations as they relate to security, as they relate to economic security, and so on. We don't have that legacy to deal with here in Canada. And even if we do marginally, I think in many ways we have to articulate a vision of Asian studies in Canada that is able to jettison that. Unlike the Europeans, we don't have also the legacy of colonialism in the region. So in other words, in many ways, Asian studies in Canada enjoys a certain intellectual tabula rasa. And that's a great position of advantage. We may not have the first mover advantages temporally, but intellectually I think that we have a vantage point that provides with us tremendous intellectual latitude. And it was with that impulse then in 2006, the Asian Institute applied for what was called the Academic Initiatives Fund, which was a provostial fund, and it sounds in many ways similar to what President Dean was describing in terms of the kinds of initiatives that he and his office seek to seed here at McMaster University. And the Asian Institute put forth an application and articulated a new kind of Asian studies that we stressed was unencumbered by the legacies of the Cold War, but also stressed, and these are the 3 points I want to touch on today, 3 dynamics of Asian studies that we wanted to build as part of the foundation of the Asian Institute at the U of T. And I'm delighted to also to let you know that we did win an Academic Initiatives Fund grant. It was in the order of about $1.1 million over 3 years, plus 4 faculty lines. The 3 points that we stressed, and I think that these have been the cornerstones, if you will, of the Asian Institute's evolution over the last 6 or 7 years are as follows. The first is an emphasis on multidisciplinary research and teaching. And here I want to stress that even the University of Toronto, which experienced its own budget restraints and kind of fiscal austerity in which many departments and units across the university, many of which happen to be in the humanities, were threatened. Despite this prevailing conventional wisdom of the assault on the humanities, the Asian Institute has been able to maintain the autonomy to ensure a multidisciplinary research agenda. As the director of the Asian Institute, as a political scientist, a political economist, I have often stressed that the intellectual agenda at the Asian Institute is driven by the humanities. The rest of us social scientists just simply glom on these fantastic ideas. And so early on, for instance, in the funding of our research clusters at the Asian Institute, we mandated that any seed funding for any research cluster had to comprise faculty and students from both the social sciences and the humanities. If you didn't have that, you didn't qualify. And out of that came some fantastic initiatives, for instance, Markets and Modernities, which has remained an enduring research cluster. It was the focus of a blue ribbon panel at the Association for Asian Studies conference about 3 years ago. This was a way of bringing humanities scholars and social scientists around a multidisciplinary theme of markets and modernities. And I think this has been absolutely critical in creating the kind of intellectual space that draws colleagues from across the university. The Asian Institute is a place where people can do research and teaching that they otherwise couldn't do in their own departments. That's how we have built the place, and indeed that's how people have, I think, responded quite positively. Now, on one level, multidisciplinarity is something that everybody talks about. Multidisciplinary in many ways, actually, is not that difficult to build. You just put people from different disciplines in the same room. Multidisciplinary sometimes can entail, and I often lament this, just simply a division of intellectual labor. What we've been trying to stress at the Asian Institute, and this leads to my second point, is actual interdisciplinary research. We oftentimes use the two terms, multi and interdisciplinary research and teaching interchangeably. They're fundamentally different. Multidisciplinary research just brings different perspectives to bear on a common problem. Interdisciplinary research requires us to begin to learn new vocabularies, to begin to learn each other's vocabularies, and to begin to appreciate each other's points of view. To this end, the second issue, or the second cornerstone of the Asian Institute, is the fact that we do not focus on countries. Rather, all of our research and teaching are thematically driven. And this is absolutely important, because when we begin to build a research agenda on themes as opposed to the study of China, the study of Japan, Southeast Asia, or South Asia, but rather begin to build research clusters around things like social capital in Asia, markets and modernities, Asian futures, global capitalism and speculation, and so on, then suddenly you are forcing different disciplines to act and interact in ways that are much more interdisciplinary in nature. To this day, our contemporary Asian studies program, which has 150 majors and minors, which is at capacity, to this day, we do not have a single course that has a country name in it or a sub-regional demarcation. Every class is titled by a theme: comparative modernities in Asia, comparative colonialisms in Asia, and so on. This is the way in which we have conceptualized the Asian Institute, and I think this has been absolutely critical to the continued evolution of the AI at U of T. The last point I want to bring up is conversations. The tagline at the Monk School is "Join the global conversation." We view it slightly differently, even though we are located inside the Monk School. We recognize that there are plenty of global conversations about Asia. What we're trying to expose, to expound upon, to interrogate, are the conversations in Asia about the global. And that's fundamentally different. The global conversations on Asia are the ones that we hear in the hallowed halls of Ottawa inside the Beltway. They're the ones that we hear about in Brussels and so on. What we are trying to convey are the conversations that are going on inside Asia about the changing global landscape. And once you turn the lens that way, you recognize that there is tremendously fertile and fecund ground for us to really interrogate and to really raise interesting research questions. What this also means then is that it allows us to really discover what Asia's concerns are about the rest of the world. And once you begin to appreciate what Asia's concerns are about the rest of the world, you also realize the categories that we use to understand Asia actually bear much less fruit than we would imagine. It's when you begin to engage conversations in Asia about the global that you recognize, for instance, and this is the area in which I do my work, health is a major concern inside Asia, and the conversations inside Asia do not comport to the kinds of categories that we use here that puts our public health scholars in one corner, usually very far away in the university, and our humanities scholars in another part of the university. When you're actually inside Asia engaging in these conversations, you realize that the conversations intimately bring together the humanities, the sciences, and the social sciences. Related to that, and I just want to finish with a comment on students. If indeed our goal is to begin to interrogate and expound upon the conversations inside Asia about the global, it's absolutely imperative that we ensure that our students are inside Asia. Oftentimes we think about the training of Asianists as requiring lots of work back at home first, and until they reach that threshold, they can't go to Asia. We have found actually quite the opposite. You get them to Asia, and they fall in love. You get them to Asia, and their curiosities are piqued. And they come back wanting to learn more. They come back much more motivated in their language courses. They come back with a set of questions that we haven't even considered in our own research agendas. And to that end, the Asian Institute has made it a priority over the last 10 years to raise as much funds, as many resources as possible. And it's not just money, it's about connections, it's about the soft infrastructures and so on, to get our students over there. So we have now students, I have 2 former students who just pitched a documentary film to the Real Asian International Film Festival and won. And now they're going to be filming a documentary in Taipei. I have another group of students who are all 4.0 graduates, could have gone on to do anything they wanted. They wanted to work in the social innovation space. I asked them, where do you want to do it? And of all places, they picked Taiwan. Every year, we bring 20 students to participate in a 3-week seminar with students at Fudan University. I remember the first year we launched this, we had 20 applicants for 20 spots. And this past year, we had 120 applicants for 20 spots. The key is getting them to Asia. And once they are there, it enlivens the research agenda back home, and it certainly prepares our young people to be the global leaders we expect them to be. In closing then, this is an exciting time for McMaster. I was just recently in India with a good colleague of mine, Stan Zlotkin, from the medical school. He was former vice president of Sick Kids Hospital and also a graduate of McMaster Medical School. And we were talking about his experience at Mac. And I asked him why he went to Mac. And he said at the time, it was really a new program. But what he found extremely appealing, in addition to the fact that it wasn't expected that he had to memorize everything. But what he found extremely appealing was the core fundamental mission of the medical school and understanding medicine and the provision of medicine and health research fundamentally differently than we would see in conventional universities around the world. McMaster therefore has a phenomenal track record in doing cutting-edge work, in thinking about cutting-edge institution building, and I encourage you to do the same with respect to Asian studies. And now that I am the soon-to-be no longer director of the Asian Institute, you can count on me to help as much as I possibly can. Thank you.
Okay, so our next speaker is Philip Kelly from the University, from York University.
Thanks, Richard. Thank you to Natina for organizing today's event. Natina's logistical and organizational skills have been impeccable in every respect except telling me to wear a tie. I didn't know everybody else was going to be so dressed. But at York, you actually have to be a dean or above to wear a tie. We're not actually allowed. You get issued with official York ties at that point, but not before. So Natina has given us a set of questions to address. And I'm going to touch on some of those in a moment, but I think it's worth picking up on one of President Dean's comments, which concerns the need to develop a distinctive approach to Asian studies that fits with particular contexts. And in other words, not picking what has been done in other places and copying it, but developing a locally distinctive approach to the task. And I think it's important to remember that all of our centers are quite different. I did my PhD at UBC and actually wrote my dissertation on the second floor of the Institute for Asian Research. I spent a sabbatical at the Asian Institute a few years ago. I think I'm the only person who's ever moved closer to home for a sabbatical leave. And each of our institutes, I think, work quite differently. In the center at York, we have a mandate that defines Asia in a certain way, and I'll say more about how we define Asia in a moment, but we define Asia in terms of Southeast Asia, East Asia, South Asia, and the Asian diaspora. And we have 4 elements to the mandate that we try to pursue. The first one is intellectual exchange. So we're a hub for interdisciplinary conversations across an enormous sprawling campus at York, but also in terms of conversations with Asia scholars elsewhere in Canada and around the world, and in particular in Asia, of course. So that involves workshops, conferences, speaker series, and so forth. We're a site at York for research support, and this isn't a role that all centers of this kind play, but we actually support scholars at York in terms of developing research grant proposals and administering those grants. A third part of our mandate, which is really significant, is graduate training. So we have a graduate diploma in Asian Studies, we have awards for graduate travel to conferences, for graduate research, getting students into Asia, as Joe was saying, and language training as well. So those languages that it is hard to study in formal programs in the Toronto area, we have a fund that allows students to study those as well. And then finally, what is fashionably known as knowledge mobilization. In other words, getting our research out into the hands of stakeholders, whether they be government policymakers, community organizations, advocacy groups, the private sector, into the hands of people who can actually use some of the work that York scholars are doing. But also knowledge mobilization in reverse, I guess, which is that we also see a role for the community around us in our learning about Asia. So we also have resources that are dedicated to bringing Asian diaspora communities from the Toronto area onto campus to talk to us about their not just from the Toronto area, but beyond as well, to talk to us about their knowledge and their learning. So we've had panels on human rights in the Philippines, for example, in which we had former political prisoners from the Filipino community in Toronto come in and talk about both their experiences and their advocacy over the years on those issues. So those are the 4 elements of our mandate, which we try to support in a modest way. And although the centre may sound grandiose from the outside, it essentially consists of the bit of teaching that I'm released from and one other person. That is the sort of the extent of the administrative apparatus we have at our disposal. So we try to do a lot with not so much. One of Natina's questions, first the question that Natina posed for us was, do you see any gaps in the way Canada engages Asia? And I wanted to just highlight a few things here. I think one gap is, or one gap in the way in which we may think about Asia is, what is Asia? And where exactly are we talking about? And that involves not just that involves where we place boundaries around Asia. And we have constant questions at our centre as to why we decide to stop at the western border of Pakistan. What happened to Afghanistan? A student came to my office a few months ago and said, I'm Iranian. If I'm not Asian, what am I? And I didn't really have a good answer to that question. But we have these kind of historical regionalizations that we construct and place rather arbitrary lines around what constitutes Asia. So it's important to think about where Asia starts and stops. And one of the ways in which we address that, in addition to placing rather arbitrary lines on the map, is that we think about Asia in a porous way, in a transnational way. So we're concerned, and that is why the 4th element of our mandate is the Asian diaspora. So we have scholars working on Asian communities and with Asian communities in Canada, but also Asian communities around the world in East Africa, for example. So we do think about Asia in a very transnational way. Secondly, another gap in the way that we engage with Asia is that we do tend sometimes, I think, to have a rather breathless excitement with rising Asia, booming Asia. And we think about, we reach for hyperbole around booming cities, stock markets, and industrial zones. And I think it's important to not simply glorify economic growth and new markets and those kinds of opportunities, but also to think about those left behind in those processes. So we do try to emphasize critical scholarship that thinks about those who are denied rights and those who are not participating in the glorious rise of Asia. Of course, many Canadian advocacy groups are doing this, and we try to engage with them in the work that we do. And then, of course, the 3rd element that mustn't be left out is as I've already mentioned, the transnational dimension. So thinking about Canada's ties with Asia, not just as economic and political and geopolitical, but also social and cultural in terms of the family ties that exist in so many communities, particularly in the Toronto region, the Toronto and Hamilton region, with society, cultures, families back home in Asia. So it's important to think about Asia around us as well. Another question that, and I'm not going to answer all the questions because 10 minutes wouldn't be enough, but another question was, and I found this the most intriguing, I think, what do you know now about running an Asian research center that you wished you had known when you started? The better person to answer this would be my predecessor, Susan Henders, who I'm sure had even more reflections on these questions after running the centre for 5 years. I've been doing it for just over a year and a half. I think one of the things that I would say to that question is that, and I came to York from a Southeast Asian Studies program at the National University of Singapore, so I was kind of already immersed in the area studies way of doing things in some ways. But area studies in general and Asian studies, which breaks off at such an enormous chunk of the world, is an enormously inchoate concept. Asia is, it goes without saying, massively diverse. In fact, it's an enormous conceit to treat it as an as a construct that can be defined and known and experienced. It is enormously internally diverse. And that means that what people do under the banner of Asian studies and Asian research is equally diverse. But I think one of the things that binds it together, and I guess this is my geographical identity coming through, is that it is an engagement with place. It's an engagement with place, and not just Asia as a whole as a place, which would be somewhat ridiculous, but with particular places. And I think in many ways, when I engage with other Asianist scholars, that's what binds us together, a concern with a particular commitment to and long-term commitment to understanding and engaging with a particular place. Whether in my case it's with the Philippines, in other cases it's with Taiwan, Pakistan, China, Japan, and so forth. But I think it's that engagement with place that's important. And I think that distinguishes Asian studies from rubrics in which it's sometimes subordinated, like international studies or globalization studies. The concerns of an area studies scholar are not the same as the person who studies global structures and global frameworks. I think the commitment to particular places and particular histories, cultures, politics, and so on are a really important part of area studies. But with that diversity of places, it is an enormously, as I've said, inchoate field. And so what I found is that I've been going to events and be participating in discussions that I would never have imagined myself involved in the past, and have very little prior knowledge to bring to the conversation. But I think that's enormously enriching, to engage with people who have similarly deep and long-term commitments to other places, and to engage in similar thematic concerns across different contexts. So I felt enormously privileged to be able to engage with others in that way across this enormously diverse field. At the same time, it's incredibly difficult to get people to come to be warned, Natina. It's incredibly difficult to people to show up to talks that you think, wow, I'm so glad I came to this. That was interesting. I just wish more people were here. And the other thing that I think about in relation to that question is in running a center of this kind, and this is more a practical issue, one can get buried in so many details of administrivia and little questions that require little answers, that it is often quite difficult to step back and say, what is my vision? What is the long-term goal of this center? And Joe articulated the Institute at U of T very well, but I think it's really difficult to step back and say what is that larger goal, what is that strategic vision, and keep your eye on the horizon while you're dealing with all the little bits and pieces that come up every day. And it's difficult to have a vision when we're talking about a field that is so enormous and necessarily incoherent. There were at least half a dozen other questions, and I don't think I'm going to get to them all, but we'll have time to talk later in the day. So I will, for now, leave it there.
So we now move on to Paul Evans from the University of British Columbia.
Thank you. Thank you, Richard, and initially for the promotional material on my new book. It's a book on engaging China that is a book designed to be short, accessible, and deal with a topic that is in the minds not just of scholars, but the community that scholars serve. And while I'm not here to talk about the book, I would be delighted to privately, this is really a chance for me to do precisely the same thing with this audience. It's exciting to be here, and as many of you who don't know Natina will soon understand, she is irresistible. Natina Tan, when has an idea, she decides to move on it. She does it, and she does it in a way that is infectious. Now, for the disease people here, I don't mean infectious in that way. I mean infectious in the sense that she brings others along. And has been telling me exciting things about her colleagues here and the challenges, the difficulties, the million problems of getting something going. But also a time and a place where you might be able to do something that's really distinctive. In 25 years of running institutes in Canada, helping set up the Asia Center at Harvard, being at where our earlier colleagues have been in Toronto, now in Vancouver, and now I'm working with 6 universities in different parts of the world, 2 of them in Canada, other than my own, and in Asia. And everyone is wrestling with the McMaster challenge. What do we do going forward in this broad area of where universities connect with a part of the world, transitions in the world that no one has got their minds fully around? So if I have one message for today, look everywhere, think about what others are doing, and forget it. You're going to build something on the soil that is distinctive to McMaster and the people in this room. I imagine the photographers who are here, they really don't care about us at the front of this room. If I were them, I'd have the cameras on you, because it's going to be what probably is a core group here with your president, with your deans. You're going to build something. I have no idea what it's going to look like. But think that, like all of us at the institutions where we are, getting a handle on contemporary Asia, however defined, is a task everybody's undertaking. Don't buy for a moment that you're latecomers and that's a problem. UBC has been in the China and Asia business for 100 years. We're latecomers, and we're reinventing drastically our approach in the context of new circumstances. I spent last week at the Harvard Business School. Harvard's had a connection to China for a while. Harvard is changing its approach to China because of a new center it's set up, also because it feels the field of just China is becoming so competitive, so diverse, and so darn interesting that the mechanisms and the institutions Harvard has put in place, layer after layer after layer, are no longer adequate. So, starting from that point, you're really in a great position. Do something new that you think is interesting, that you want to work on. And I'd only raise 2 questions for the mind as this is happening, as this group of students and professors and administrators try to say, why at our university? Why and what should we be doing? 2 observations that are kind of questions that I see all of us grappling with, all of us having headaches and exciting moments as we come to answers. Number 1 is scope. Not so much scope of where the area is, what Asia is, what it's becoming, how it connects to us. Our tagline at the Asia Pacific Foundation, when I used to have some involvement there for some years, was Asia isn't over there, Asia is here, Asia is everywhere. There are connections. We need place-based knowledge, but we also need transnational knowledge. We need a whole set of things, and no university, no single mind and no university can provide them. But the scope question that I have in mind is just a little bit different. And that is, within the university, who are you going to serve and who do you want to work with? Most of our institutes, and the ones we've heard about today, the wonderful institute in Toronto, the 2 institutes in Toronto now, many other parts of the world, most of them are focusing on the social sciences and humanities because they're studying Asia, a phrase that Natina did not choose, but that most universities are choosing is something related to Asia, East Asia, Asia-Pacific studies. And that's an interesting frame of it, because my hunch is that what's going on at McMaster is a lot of the stuff you're doing and want to do isn't about studies per se. It's about connecting. It'll be about teaching, which could be part of the studies mandate. It'll be about research. It's also going to be reaching to communities and players that are outside the university. Philip mentioned the interesting point of knowledge mobilization. My sense is all of our universities are struggling with a question that's way beyond how we do good studies, but how we communicate it, how we connect it to publics that pay our bills. We're public institutions. But more importantly, that we feel now we have to connect to. Being a China specialist, or at least an international China specialist as I was for some years, writing for an academic audience is great. It got me tenure, it got me a wonderful wife who kind of thought it was good work I was doing. But it isn't enough anymore. It's how we connect to the people who make differences in dealing, in my case, with contemporary China, the purpose of my book. So, for studies, how can you go beyond? And McMaster, there's no institution in Canada. York has been a great one. Simon Fraser University is really terrific at it. And McMaster is connecting to that larger audience. But the scope question also relates to who you are. And at our institutes, Harvard's wrestling with it, we have a major tension on it at UBC, is are we trying to deal with people who are Asian specialists, who know the kind of place-based knowledge that Philip spoke about, who really devote their lives to studying something about China or something about India or something about Bangladesh and Bangladesh's connections with the world. The real, what some of us would call the real scholars. Is that the audience? Is that the core audience? Is it the only audience? What we're finding at many of our institutions now is that the people who are connecting to Asia are a lot bigger than our social science and humanities colleagues. At UBC, when we did a study just of our China specialists, well, let me put it differently, just of the people who define themselves at UBC as having a significant professional interest in Asia or in China, is our special focus. We found about 550 professors who said yes. Less than a fifth of those were Asia specialists. So the community of Asia specialists is probably at McMaster, my guess is. Same thing, it's at Harvard. We're doing the same study at Singapore Management University. University of Alberta is doing the same study right now. What is the constituency? Is it the 100 people, maybe 50 people, maybe 200 people if you're a big university, who are Asia specialists, or is it the others across the university? And that is a crucial decision, because if you go for the big picture, if you go for people in engineering, in medicine, in health sciences, in environmental studies, many of those people can't spell China 2 out of 3 times. But what they can do is they are the connectors. To give us an example, at the University of British Columbia, there is one program in the Faculty of Medicine that has more funding on China than all of our work in the social sciences combined. The dollars are not in social science. And as others in the university are moving, it's a question whether you want to be part of that or connect to it. There's very good logics for staying with Asian studies or something like that. But there's also a real logic to making this. Joe gave and the president, some very interesting distinctions between interdisciplinarity and multidisciplinarity. How big your group's going to be. And let me finish with one other thing that you've got an interesting president, eh? I mean, his approach on this, I have no idea whether what he really has in mind, because I don't believe your university has an Asia strategy yet. I don't know your international strategy, but you don't yet have an Asia strategy. But the themes that he pushed and the openness on this, I think you've got somebody who can give you some air cover for what you want to do on the ground. And I'm sorry we don't have him with us for this, because the summary of this that goes to him and others are important. No university depends on a president, but no university can go far in this area without presidential help. And I would circle back, if there were one message for the presidents that's here, that I would do a triple kowtow, that I would bow to him for what he said, was about the engagement of students. And it's a funny thing for a guy who's been running research institutes. I didn't teach undergraduates for 24 years when I've been running institutes. I didn't teach first-year students like Joe Wong does for 32 years in a university. So we sort of get away from students, except for the special graduate students. My sense is that the richness of who you have at McMaster, who are They live Asia. My students at UBC, we want to get them to Asia. This is important. More than half of my students are Asian, in the sense they've come from Asia. They've been born there, they've come to study with us, or are first-generation kids who are with families. You've got a wealth here, and how you connect to that is, I think, one of the big challenges. And I would lay one last hope, is that whatever happens on the research front, whatever happens on the public communication front, please come up with some great ideas about how to teach Asia better to and with students at the institution. The great revolutions, it strikes me, is how we're changing our teaching. Having not taught undergraduates for 30 years and went back to Hong Kong U for a year to learn how to teach again to undergraduates, their involvement was so crucial to my education, but to where I think at the end of the day, we're public educators. We're not think tanks. We are not research institutes that exist independent. We're at public institutions where our business line, our model, what we do is we teach students. And so in this group here, can I ask a question? How many of you in this room are students? Okay, keep your hands up if you're an undergraduate student. Okay, you people are the future. You're the great group. Do you see how many of those hands up? Can you put those up again? Undergraduate students here. I hope over lunch I want to ask you why you're here and what you expect and what you want. Because with due respect to my colleagues, the department chairs, the professors from across the university, they're for you. They don't matter. Tell this group what you want to do, and if you can engage students in this planning process from the outset, boy, you're going to have a lot of people knocking on your door to know how you've done it well. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Paul. And our final, in this first round of speakers, is Kazi Rao. He's with the Asia Pacific Foundation. He's a vice president, and he's the director of the Toronto office, amongst many other things. Kazi.
Thank you, Richard. As the final speaker, I'll make my comments in bullet points. Let me say, just picking up on Paul Evans' final point, 25 years ago I was a master's student, and my professor at that time was Richard Stubbs. And at that time, when you said Asia, 6 of the top 10 banks in the world were Japanese. So when you said Asia in 1989, you really meant Japan, and we've seen how it's evolved since. My comments are in 3 buckets. The first one is to answer Natina's questions, the 3 questions that I've categorized. 1, gaps. 2, what should McMaster do? 3, resources. And I want to begin by tackling that in the following manner. What is the context for this discussion? In one of my capacities, I have the privilege of serving as the Vice President of the Asia Pacific Foundation, as Richard noted. And in one of the many things we do, we conduct an annual poll. And what the annual poll tells you is what the Canadian attitudes are to Asia by region and by country. And let me just make a few points on that. Number 1, there's a clear recognition, especially in the case of powers like China and India laterally, that we need to pay more attention to it and we need to understand it better. However, there is a deep sense of ambivalence across Canada on what this rise means and what we should do. The second is that a strong majority of Canadians oppose some very specific activities pertaining to state-owned enterprises. Number 3, Canadians feel the greatest warmth to Japan. Number 4, views on temporary workers, Canadians are very down on. Views on Asian professionals, considerably higher. And finally, more Canadians are traveling to Asia. That's the context in which this is measured. And so roughly speaking, oversimplifying here to be sure, but the receptivity and the engagement, sense of excitement with Asia starts highest out in BC and then starts falling off as we come across the country. So in that kind of context, what should be the elements of our response? And here let me make 3 points. Number one, and this has been touched on by our previous speakers, we need to have a high tolerance for ambiguity. Ambiguity is a core skill here. It's not, white or black, it's shades of gray, because gray is an intrinsic color. It's not simply the derivative of black and white.
That's correct.
That is, many of the countries in Asia are competitors and collaborators at one and the same time. So that's point number one, which is to have a high degree of receptivity for the element of ambiguity. Number two, while you see remarkable economic progress and economic integration, you also see a huge rise in defense budgets. So here, what you have is the confluence of the geopolitical and the economic. One, which is more inward-looking, and the other, which is more outward-looking, i.e. the economic side. And what that means, therefore, and this is my third point, is that the Strait of Malacca now is becoming the new Suez Canal. Just as we thought about the Suez in the Atlantic century, and now as we look at the Asia and the Pacific century, the Strait of Malacca becomes a critical choke point. A choke point both from a defense perspective and from an economic perspective. So think about it, that a third of the world's current crude oil supply goes through the Strait of Malacca. The fourth point, which is related here on the economic side is, and here it is the rise of new companies. Boston Consulting, every year for the last 7 years, has been releasing a report. It's an annual report. This year's report is called as Allies and Adversaries. And what this report says, the 2013 version, is that there are 100 new global challengers that we are yet to pay attention to. And of the 100, 30 are from China, no surprise there, and 20 are from India, perhaps no surprise there either. What's interesting is that even within the annual surveys, there has been a transition. So when they came out with the first survey in 2006, 65 of the companies were from China and India, 44 from China, 21 from India. And now what you see happening is those two have gone down a bit, that is from 65 to 50, but a whole bunch of others have come up, from Philippines, from Malaysia, from Indonesia. And so you see a remarkable rise of new companies that we have yet to pay attention to. And depending on how you measure it, some 500 of these companies, of the overall companies surveyed, have crossed $1 billion in sales and are now looking for outward bound investment. Where are they going to come? And therefore, understanding the economic aspect, which will in many ways lead to more engagement, will become deeply critical. The specific points I want to make are something like this, and this was one of the questions Natina asked, which is, what do you know now that if you had known earlier, you would do better? And I think, as somebody said, the problem with life is you live it forwards and you understand it backwards. But let me give you an example of the talent agenda. So about 15 years ago in this country, we had the launch of the Canada Research Chairs Program. And at that time when we launched it, the sense was we need to attract talent both for the senior chairs and for the junior chairs. We never thought of it as a China strategy. It has de facto become, in part, a welcome China strategy. So of the 1,800 faculty members that we have recruited since then, since 2000, the truly international are about 550, and about 1/5 have come from China, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. And I dare say, if you had spoken to Prime Minister Chrétien at that time in 2000, I don't think it started off as a China strategy, or indeed as an Asia strategy, but it has got a distinct Asian hue to it. And what this means, therefore, is that we are now increasingly living in the world of, not so much brain drain and brain gain, but brain chains, right? The second point I want to make, and I've got 3 others, is that the issue of building Asia competence in this country will become critical. And at the foundation, we commissioned a task force on this, led by David Mulrooney, who is jointly with the Monk Center and with the Asia Pacific Foundation. And what this report came out, it just came out a few months ago, is it said that we need to do three things, broadly speaking. It's called as the 3 E's. One, Canadians increasingly need to have exposure on Asia. Number 2, they need to have experience in Asia. And number 3, they need to have expertise in Asia. And it doesn't mean that all of us need to fall into the last category instantly, but what it does mean is that increasingly we should find ourselves in one of those three categories. My final 3 points are that we need, this is a big country, and we should have the capacity to build regional strategies. And I'll just give you the example of ports, 3 ports: Port of Halifax, Centre Port in Manitoba and Winnipeg, and Port of Vancouver. Perhaps Vancouver and Halifax are obvious in terms of their respective connections. Vancouver particularly so. Halifax, going through the Suez, gets you through India a day and a half sooner than any port on the West Coast. It's also a deep water port, and it is one of the ports competing with about 4 other ports on the East Coast, New Jersey being one of them, and the like. But you don't instinctively think of Halifax as potentially an Asia-oriented port, but it is increasingly becoming an Asia-oriented port. 50% of their growth is in 2 markets, Vietnam and India, and Vancouver has been in that space for a long time. Centre Port in Winnipeg, less than 5 years old, and they're looking over the Arctic into China, but beyond China as well. And so I think in a big country like Canada, we need to have the capacity to develop regional strategies. My final 2 points are, people often talk about diaspora networks, and indeed it's a great strength that Canada possesses. But too often the diaspora connection is mentioned in numeric terms. You know, we have people from Philippines or India or Pakistan or China, and we give a number. We say so many millions are here from that part of the world. What we miss out is that these networks increasingly are also knowledge networks. And we need to tap into the knowledge aspect of it. I'm familiar in particular with the Indian context. The IIT Alumni Association, depending on who they get at their gathering, this is the Indian Institute of Technology Alumni Association, the patent wealth in the room could be anywhere from $2 to $5 billion. When they met in Chicago recently, they had a whole bunch of CEOs, knowledge thinkers, and what I would call as India watchers. This year, they're gathering in Toronto. And I'm pleased to say that your president is there, and I think we need more leaders like that connecting to these networks. Day before yesterday on Bay Street, there was a TiQuest, which looks at the whole area of venture capital, new technologies, and how they're addressing global challenges. And it's not the usual suspects, but those are the folks we need to pay attention to, because that's where the entrepreneurs are, and that's where they're thinking about the future. And my final comment, and it's easy to provide advice, but it's for you to implement, is what is distinctive about McMaster's agenda? I think that's the question to answer. And in building a distinctive agenda, I think being deeply responsive to the Asian agenda would be important. It's no use simply saying, you know, we're good at this and we're good at that. But how is it responsive to the agenda in whatever part of Asia you're looking at? Second, related to that, and that's my concluding point, is whatever the financial commitment is, and in a time of strained budgetary resources, you will hear this often, my only advice would be is front-end your financial commitment. So if you've got X dollars over 5 years, spend it over 3. And my experience in working with various Canadian institutions is those are the ones that tend to have had tangible success because they've been able to jump the queue and at the same time respect whatever their budgetary limitations are. Thank you for listening.
Well, thank you very much, Kazi. What we'd like to do now is to find out if there are any questions to our distinguished set of panelists. Or comments.
Yeah, my name is Boniface Mutatina. I'm from Uganda. I'm a PhD student of health policy at McMaster University in Kampala, Uganda. I'm here for a winter term as an exchange program, and I happen to be in Tina Turner's class of comparative politics. My question probably goes to all speakers. I'm wondering what collaboration opportunities that could be existing in all these institutes and centers with non-Asian institutions that could be outside Canada or could be outside Asian countries like McMaster University in Uganda. Thank you.
Okay, so I think these microphones work on the table. So the exchange, I think what is more than that comes out of that is exchange students. I think if you could comment on your own institutions, exchange students, but I think also you're looking at if you know of any exchange opportunities for universities outside of Canada. But I think that we would be really interested in your own observations on the whole issue of exchange students. Value, the kinds of exchanges that you're looking at, what you think are the best means of introducing students through exchanges. I know that a number of universities across Canada have exchange opportunities, including McMaster. But I think that any observations you have would be really helpful.
I'll make a more general comment. Thank you very much for the question and the observation, and I'm delighted to see that you've chosen to spend part of your education here in Canada. With respect to programs outside of Asia, I believe was what you're asking. One of the reasons why I wanted to stress in my comments that the way in which the Asian Institute at the University of Toronto is organized is to try to capture and examine the conversations inside Asia about the global will allow for precisely the kinds of partnerships that we might not typically expect. So given that our work is so thematically driven, so in many ways theoretically driven, rather than the conventional way, which is to think about it in terms of countries, it allows for those kinds of possibilities. So we do have a group of colleagues who are working on the politics of political transformation, and some of their work has been published broadly, and now there are some collaborations, for instance, with colleagues in Addis Ababa and Ethiopia and places like that. But that's all research driven. The broader comment about exchanges, recently I was part of the task force that Cassie mentioned that was chaired by David Mulroney. And I remember one of the key tasks was to ask our Office of Student Exchanges about our international partnerships. And we asked all of the universities to do this. And I thought the University of Toronto was bad in terms of having almost, it seemed like, thousands of partnerships and MOUs and purported relationships with institutions outside of Canada. Then I saw the University of Alberta's, and boy, was that really huge. The point being is that most of these partnerships are moribund. They're not functioning. They're simply paper relationships. And so one of the things that many of us at the Asian Institute have encouraged our senior administration at the university is to think about our partnerships much more strategically, to front-load content, substantive content in these relationships, in the development of these partnerships, as opposed to signing what are invariably empty MOUs and other statements of relationships. So we have in many ways pared back a lot of our partnership institutions, particularly with respect to exchanges, because we're not able to really effectively manage them. We're not effectively able to share those experiences with our students. We're spread too thin. And so we've actually taken our list of what were once hundreds of institutions and pared them back to, I would say, probably 30 or 40 effective partnership institutions, and then built upon that much more effective exchange programs, because it's now, we're sending much more robust numbers back and forth. There's a familiarity on a very social and personal level between the administrators, and indeed the students themselves as cohorts begin to develop inter-cohort or intergenerational relationships as well. So as a strategy, as you think about exchanges and those kinds of partnerships, I would suggest you be much more selective and strategic as opposed to signing every single partnership that comes your way.
Phil, yeah.
Just taking the question in a slightly different direction. One of the issues that and that's away from exchanges and towards the recruitment of international students. There's certainly been a big drive at York in recent years to recruit international undergraduate students. I think that is largely a fiscally driven enterprise. But at the research level, international graduate students become incredibly important. And unfortunately, the way that provincial funding works in Ontario, international graduate students receive no support whatsoever from provincial operating grants to universities, which means that universities are in turn incentivized to take as few as possible. Which is extremely unfortunate. My view is that international graduate students add a huge amount to the institution and to research programs. And if they cost money, well, so does a library, but you don't argue with having a decent library at a research institution. So I don't know what McMaster's position is on international students and recruiting them into master's and PhD programs. But I think a lot of Ontario universities are having difficulties on that front and are responding to the incentives from the provincial government by really cutting back. I know that York's just enormously increased the fees that will be paid by international students and have cut away a program of differential fee scholarships. If McMaster can do something more creative than that, then I think the field is yours, in fact. And graduate students, it's not just a question of recruiting the best from around the world, but it's also a question of maintaining ongoing research programs and relationships with other places in Asia by recruiting graduate students and enabling students to come and work at your institution and then go back and be part of your network over there. So I'd say think about international graduate student recruitment and lobby hard for that.
Okay, we have one and then second, okay, and then third. Very good.
Hi, I teach in the Department of English and Cultural Studies. My name is Chandrima Chakravarti, and my question is about what Joe was saying and what Philip Kelly brought up. I see a very different vision in the way sort of Asian studies or the institute, how you've sort of placed it. One, a very place emphasis in terms of area studies, Cold War kind of that drawing from the sort of American Asian studies model, and you're talking about Asian studies more thematically. But I'm also wondering, just in terms of logistics and thinking of McMaster. So, for instance, I teach in the English and Cultural Studies program, and I teach courses on South Asia, but it's of course more thematic, or it's sort of post-colonial. So I do a little bit of Africa, a little bit of South Asia and stuff. So I'm also wondering, logistically, do you think, Joe, in particular, UFT is able to do that, or you are able to do that in terms of a thematic centered institute, because you have, say, New College, you have a South Asian Studies program, and you have a Caribbean Studies program. Does that then allow you to do something differently? Which I'm wondering, if McMaster really has those many bodies doing, say, South Asia or Africa or Caribbean in that sense, to be able to mount a nation's research institute in that sense. Just wondering, what is possible at UFT? Is it because of other things?
Thank you very much for the question. Yes, you're absolutely right. U of T enjoys, I wouldn't say it's the fact that we have a South Asian Studies program, which is actually part of the Asian Institute, or that we have all of these other institutes. I sometimes lament that we have so many institutes and center. The organization chart at U of T is incomprehensible. But we do have scale, and that I think is really important. I mean, there are about 150 affiliated scholars with the Asian Institute just in the humanities and social sciences, 30 of whom would identify themselves as South Asianists, 9 who would call themselves Indonesianists. I don't know of any other university in which you have 9 scholars working on Indonesia, and these are tenured or tenure-track faculty members. So we have tremendous scale. Now, having said that, that allows then for these kinds of thematic clusters. It allows us to have more thematic clusters. It allows for us to have a much more decentralized sensibility amongst the faculty. That is to say, my department, for instance, we have 90 professors in political science, which means that I don't really have to hang out in political science because no one can ever tell if I'm there or not, right? So it allows me to build these other kinds of interdisciplinary relationships and collaborative linkages across the campus. However, the question of whether one organizes an Asian Institute around particular places or particular countries versus a much more thematically oriented one, such as at the AI, it would seem to me that if one or if an institution doesn't have the benefits of scale that we do at U of T, it's probably far more pressing that you organize it along thematic lines, because then you could imagine how you could have an entire Asian studies community in which you would have one or two scholars of a particular country or a particular region, or you could have a disproportionate number of scholars working on a particular country. Here I have in mind China, and that disproportion may just be simply be a function of 5 or 6 versus 1 or 2, which really in the grand scheme of knowledge generation and scholarly inquiry doesn't actually amount to much. So as one begins to think about the moorings of an Asian Institute at a place like McMaster, I would really engage in the kind of exercise that we did, which was sort of, well, what is Asian studies? And I suggested we looked at it from a Canadian perspective, that is to say, a non-American one. And then what are the broad research interests and research clusters that can engage everyone or can engage the most people? And again, one of the first ones that came out of our group was Markets and Modernities, which was really a way of rethinking post-colonial modernities for those countries that had a colonial experience, juxtaposed against the conventional wisdom of modernization theories and so on. So this was something that everybody could grapple with, and they could only grapple with at the Asian Institute. So it's finding those kinds and generating those kinds of research agendas from the bottom up, from within the professoriate and from with students, seems to me to be a good way to organize this.
Okay, anybody else? Okay, your question?
Good morning. My name is Zari Gill, and I'm feeling really enriched by the talks that we've received this morning. I have 2 comments actually, or questions. The first one is for Dr. Wong. Very intrigued to hear about looking at the things and the thoughts that are happening beyond the beltways. And it's almost like the academia have to adopt the role of lobbyists, almost, where we can influence the beltway decisions, the foreign affairs, the policies, the politicians. So, what are we, and how are we looking into that kind of an approach? And the other one is, I am one of the diseased people, but with a keen interest in the business and entrepreneurship sector. So are there any existing models, or are we going to look at models which go between health, the diseased people, and the entrepreneurships and business for-profit sector? Thank you.
Okay.
Does anyone else want to start?
Paul?
Can I do that?
Yeah.
Do we need to speak into the microphones?
Probably not.
Because you're trying to record this, is this right, Natina? Okay.
Come and stand here.
Thank you for the question and the observation, because one of the themes that emerged as kind of tensions among the panel is whether we're talking about studies a center for, a program for, an institute for Asia or something like that studies, or whether it's going to be doing some other things too. And may I ask as a centering question, the lady who asked that question, how many of you in this room are not principally connected with the social sciences or humanities? How many of you would describe yourselves as from, sort of another orientation or another field? Can I see how many hands that is? Something like that. Well, this is really fantastic. This is about 10 of you, which is about a fifth of the room. A decision, you've got to work collectively to see if you want to design a center or a program or an institute or a hub that connects across not just the humanities and social sciences, but to parts of the university that are engaged in the world in very different ways. Diseases connect to the world of Asia. They connect to the world, too, in a bigger way. And my sense is that the big frontier, the hardest frontier, is not how we connect the humanities and the social sciences. At my institution, the best program that I seeded was between the humanities and the sciences, the natural sciences, on evolutionary biology. Believe it or not, people who are doing religious studies and a history of religion in China and how they connect to evolutionary biologists. And they got a $5 million grant from the United States to pursue what they did. So, Natina, for you and your gang, what an interesting challenge is whether you're going to focus on Asian studies in some composite, or whether you're going to try and see your center as a connector across. How you're going to do interdisciplinary research, multidisciplinary research, really tough, hard to do. But how to get disease more central into it. And while I'm up, I really hope the students here, please tell us what you think, what your comments are on this. Because one of the areas that we're trying to pioneer at UBC and a couple of other universities, particularly in Hong Kong and Singapore, is how we're going to redo our teaching as a result of the collaborations, the getting to know each other that happens across fields and areas. University of Toronto is really doing terrific work on where humanities connect to social sciences. They're revolutionizing it. The frontier beyond that is how we connect into the natural sciences, how the precious knowledge of area specialists can connect, I think, outside the university, but even within it, across. It's precious, but it's not the exclusive knowledge on these matters. And I'd love if any of you have some experiments you're doing, or experiments you'd like to see on teaching. Why not a couple of you, if you're going to have a new center, give out some awards to people who will do collaborative teaching, not across departments, but across faculties. People who will do introductory courses on disease in the 21st century, the Asian dimension, or something like that. I'm giving an example of it. Is that what students want? Is that what you want? Don't be silent. Don't sit on your hands now so that a bunch of administrative types do all the discussions on this, and professors. If you have a need, if you see a possibility, that can be part of the McMaster difference.
Okay, Kathy.
Just two observations from a non-academic perspective. I was talking to a very senior federal official recently who's not with the federal government anymore, and he said when SARS outbreak happened in 2003, sitting in Ottawa, he actually didn't know who to call. There was not one phone call to make. Post-SARS, we've come up with all kinds of mechanisms on how we deal with it. I was working at a bank at that time, and when we had the first inkling of the SARS situation, we took our trading floor and we quarantined our trading floor, and because the trading function was so important. And my point here is that the business community got it instantly what the implications of this were, and took contingency measures. So that's kind of one example, which is rather than thinking about sort of the why aspect of it, it's really the how. That's where the huge gap is, and I think what all of us believe is that McMaster's had a long tradition of dealing with the how. how. I think the president mentioned the Faculty of Health Sciences, the founding in 1972 with Dr. John Evans and the like. So I think McMaster can make a real contribution in the how aspect rather than the why. Because the why aspect, we all kind of get it. We get the rise of Asia. The second part, which again is a non-academic one, I was with a few business leaders from Asia, and we were taking them across Canada because they were contemplating expansion in Canada. And they were from the tourism sector. And there were 2 or 3 observations they made. One is issues pertaining to not simply linguistic fluency, but cultural fluency. Linguistic is obvious, how many, because if we are bringing huge bands of tourists from that part of the world, for some language may be an issue, so having language capabilities would be helpful. But really the cultural fluency dealt with how you deal with the F&B function, the food and beverage function, and that the room could be a 2-star experience, but the food and beverage experience had to be a 5-star experience. Now, North American hotels and motels are not geared that way, right? So if you go to a 5-star or 7-star, you get whatever the experience. But the food and beverage experience in a 3-star hotel in North America, it's not important because you just want a place to sleep and you eat somewhere else. But for the tourists from Asia and from particularly certain countries, the F&B function is really important. So I think dealing with the how aspect again, rather than in the generalities, kind of taking it down really to the specifics, can throw up a whole bunch of solutions which may have wider applicability.
Thanks, Cassie. Yes, a student who never sits on his hands.
Hello, my name is Ian Haddon. I'm a third-year honors political science student. My question is kind of more broader for the panel here. A few of you discussed kind of the broader goals of and why it's important to engage with this initiative, but I was hoping you could go into more specific of not everyone's going to be able to travel, for instance, and I was hoping you could go into more detail on what are the other opportunities that this initiative will be providing to the student body at McMaster and the university itself.
Boy, I got ideas. Should I?
Yeah, okay, you should.
Great. You're in political science?
I am.
Do political scientists ask the best questions of anybody at this university? What do you think?
Sir, I'm not afraid to ask anything.
Yeah, critical thinking. This is fantastic. One of the things you said is really fascinating, and that's that not everybody's going to get to go to Asia. The institution that I think, if there's best practices that I've seen in Canada for trying to think through what they can do to maximize the opportunities to go to Asia, if you're not already of it in another way, is the University of Toronto. And I hope Joe will talk about this, because they're ramping up numbers, and others of us are only thinking about it. But, my sense to be a student of contemporary Asia in the 21st century was a lot different than when I was a student in the 1970s. And that Asia is here. I mean, you can look around it in our cities, and what I think you're trying to capture is the diaspora dimension. So there's a lot of people you can interact with and stuff. And it's in our teaching in a way that it wasn't. In 1973, there were only 5 courses on Chinese history taught at any universities, in all the universities in Canada combined. A tiny, tiny speck. That's changed. There's more courses you can take. But the difference is the electronic world now. With my graduate students, what we're doing in our classes is about 1/3 of the time involves guests or people who come in. And now we're connecting them from Asia real time. Well, time zones, headaches, Vancouver's tougher than McMaster. But to bring people in electronically for electronic experience. Second is engaging students who are here already with exchange and other groups who are here. The young man from Ghana who asked the question, that was on an Africa dimension. I wonder, why aren't you being a volunteer, or why aren't you being connected into some of the exchange programs that are happening here with students coming through the university? But I would, and Cassie Rao and what the Asia Pacific Foundation is trying to do in its competencies, you got to be in Asia. You got to have a field to do certain kinds of things, but you can do a lot of other things on a distance basis, partly because Asia is here, but the ability to, what's your best course? Who's your best professor? Okay, just name one of the three greats.
Stubbs.
Stubbs. Okay. That's an excellent way to get an A+ in Professor Stubbs' course, I kind of think. Does Professor Stubbs bring in living Asia into your classroom every week or every other week? Is he showing film clips? Is he hooking you in real-time conversations? Or is he one of the professors who focuses on books and articles? Who is this guy?
I thought Paul was a friend.
Books and articles. Okay, maybe we need Professor Wong to bring in the 21st dimension then too. Joel, what do you think?
In terms of my teaching?
Not about Professor Stubbs, no.
I only just learned how to use PowerPoint about 2 years ago, so I do have some are we now going?
Yeah, it's easier so that you can see the faces. Sure. Yeah. We can't see your faces when we're sitting down.
With respect to the earlier question about how do we bring these kinds of research agendas together, for instance, health, disease, and whatnot, and other kinds. Again, I want to stress we only discover these kinds of conversations when we begin to discover the conversations that are happening inside Asia. The university as an institution, the University Qua organization, is already institutionalized. The categories are drawn, the disciplines have been deciphered for us, our salary lines are fixed. And in many ways, as individuals, our institutional loyalties are determined along these sets of categories. So what we're trying to do, and what I would encourage you to think about, is how do we begin to examine the conversations that are happening inside of Asia. And once you do that, and you bring those back here, and you begin to have those conversations here, you'll suddenly see that the folks in EPI will have to be working with folks, medical anthropologists, for instance, or folks in EPI have to be working with the big data people, or the folks in EPI have to be working with the political scientists as they work in the area of public policy. And it's that kind of iterative process by which I think then you begin to see the sorts of connections that we all wish to see. And from there, things grow. I mean, I teach a graduate level course when I do, with faculty from engineering, medicine, and the business school. And we bring together our students, and this past year we taught a course where we ran a seminar on child hunger. And we look at different kinds of, particularly in the area of micronutrients, but looking at different kinds of micronutrient interventions. And it's amazing, political scientists actually have something to say about this. Once the conversation with our colleagues from Dhaka, with whom we're working in Bangladesh, once they help us understand that conversation happening inside Bangladesh. With respect to the student question, there's a fantastic, Paul, I think, has overstated our ability to deliver what is nonetheless our ambition at the University of Toronto, certainly my own, as the director of the Asian Institute, was to ensure that every one of our students had an experience in Asia. We're not quite there yet, but I'd say that we're about 75%, or 50%, 75 of our students in the cohort is able to make it. So we're about 50%, which is better than we were 10 years ago. For me, actually, the thing that really is remarkable, and one of the things that we oftentimes forget as a university institution or a university made up of administrators, is the phenomenal curiosity that students have. And we oftentimes try to plan a little too much from the top down. And we, I think, in many ways underestimate the extraordinary curiosity that students have, and therefore then the tremendous entrepreneurialism and skill that they bring to bear on these kinds of challenges, like how do I get there? They bring these kinds of skills that we as university administrators and professors have that's why we're professors. We don't have these entrepreneurial skills. So I remember very distinctly at one time I was on the advisory committee to the dean's. He had an international advisory committee, and we had some money. And the question, it was quite a bit of money, and the question was, well, what do we do with this money? And of course, the impulse is to plan. Right, is to start building programs and planning different opportunities for students. And what I had encouraged the dean to do was to rather put the resources aside as almost like a venture capital fund, and what has now become the Dean's International Initiatives Fund. And I said, look, you just You just put out a call to these fantastic students and you say, here is an opportunity to spend some time in Asia, to do research, do some collaborative work, whatever it might be. You come up with the proposal. Here are the resources that will help seed it. You figure out how you're going to raise the rest of the resources, or you figure out how we can help you raise the rest of the resources, and then you go on your way. And that program has been incredibly successful. I just mentioned I was in India last week working on this project on clean cook stoves. This was an entirely student-run project. And these were 4 students who won a Dean's International Initiatives Fund grant. It amounted to about $10,000, not much. And they were able to then gather together 2 more students from other faculties. They were able to gather resources from the various institutes, and we just created a phenomenal learning experience for 6 of our undergraduates in India, who I have no doubts, 50% of them will go back again. Thanks.
I'll be brief, so I'll just sit down. Yeah, okay. I think the question is an important one. How do you expose students to Asia if not everybody can go? Not everybody can go. It's expensive, and the resources aren't there for either on the university's part or on students' part to spend a significant amount of time away. I think at York we're pretty good at getting graduate students to Asia. We have resources that are available, and they spend significant periods doing field work and research and so on. Undergrad students, not so much. I've taught Asia, so to speak, in a number of ways. I've taught a first-year World Regions course, taught the Asia component of that. Then I've taught an upper-level Asia-Pacific development course and taught a variety of thematic issues in the Asia-Pacific region. And then most recently I've taught a specific course on the Philippines. And I think by far the most fulfilling course for me and for the students involved was the course on the Philippines. Because to understand a place you have to go into depth. You can't skate across it. And to be able to spend a semester thinking about Philippine history, it was called the Philippines Geographical Perspectives on Global Integration. So we covered a wide span of history, political, cultural, economic processes, but all with a view to the Philippines' relationship with the broader global system from colonialism onwards. And that was really rewarding, I think, because it was drilling down and really bringing students into a place and trying to understand its history, its culture, its politics, and so on. And the way we brought the place alive, if you like, in that case, was to bring speakers in from the Filipino community in Toronto. So when we were talking about martial law in the 70s and 80s, we had political prisoners come in and talk about their experiences. When we were talking about the caregiver program and migration to Canada, we had advocates come in and talk about experiences in that program. And when we were talking about environmental issues, we had people who work with organizations around mining issues, for example. So there are ways in which Asia can be brought into the classroom through first-hand experiences of people who are day in, day out working with groups and advocating on issues. And that's the way we've approached it, where not everybody can go to Asia.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm reminded, Joe's point about giving students some money, that there was a Canada ASEAN Centre some time ago that was set up by the government that used to give $5,000 to 20 students every year. Unfortunately, it got closed in the late 1990s, but it seems to me that that's something that Asia Pacific Foundation might think about. Secondly, I want to say that we've already had encouragement. The current president of the International Studies Association is Amitav Acharya, who is well known to many of us, who wished us the best in our enterprise of trying to put together an Asian research center at McMaster. His talk, which I think Susan Henders attended and I did, anybody else who did, will I think claim to have been there, because it was an amazing talk in the sense of setting down an agenda for the next 20, 25, 30 years for international relations. But importantly, Amitav is from Asia, a student of Asia. It was all about bringing Asia, Africa, Latin America into international relations. It was a talk which will be, I think, as I say, remembered for a long time. The other point that I wanted to make is that there are some really interesting panels this afternoon, and a diversity of panels on Islamic finance out of the business school. I think that's a really interesting panel. One on health, one on identity and diasporic communities, and one on war, social transformation, and modern East Asia, human rights and culture. So there is a diversity of panels this afternoon, which I would encourage you all to go. There is lunch next door, and everybody is invited. Natina has ensured that there is food for everybody. At that lunch, you can grab one of these, or all four of these four panelists, and talk about the issues that they've raised in more detail. So let me, on your behalf, thank them. I think we've had a really rich, as was pointed out, set of comments. Thanks very much.